Chapter 8 of your textbook is entitled Mental Health and Emotional Distress. And so we return to an earlier concept and definition, the concept of health, which I noted at the start of this course. It used to mean the absence of disease, but now the popular definition and the one that's used by the World Health Organization is that it's the state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. And this is probably one of the first chapters where we're going to focus almost entirely on that mental and social well-being component of the definition. As your textbook notes in the opening pages of this chapter, mental health issues have been designated by the World Health Organization as a worldwide concern, and globally, it is a leading cause of disability. If we narrow our focus to the United States, usually the statistics suggest in terms of yearly prevalence, it's about 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 adults. That experience mental disorder, the number who experience a mental illness, which differs from a mental disorder in just pervasiveness and severity and persistence. That number is a little less, or, at 13.6 million, but still significant number of people. In terms of what it cost us, it cost us worker output and efficiency, an estimated 200 million work days are lost to depression each year. It cost us real dollars in terms of the amount of money, spent on treatment and social services. And that's accounting for the fact that a lot of people who have a mental condition go untreated. So, if that's how much we are spending and people are spending who are seeking out treatment, just imagine how much greater that number could potentially be if everyone who is experiencing a mental health disorder, sought out treatment. So as we get into this chapter, let's just start off by, a good definition. So the definition that I would like for you to know for mental disorder is that it's a psychological or behavioral condition that causes distress and reduces a person's ability to participate in everyday life. And so that's how it's related to disability, right? It's that contributing factor inhibiting people to fully live their lives. All societies have some individuals who behave in ways considered unacceptable and incomprehensible. Whether or not their behavior kind of reaches that point where it is medicalized and labeled as a mental disorder, that does vary by historical time, context, as well as place. And we're going to talk more in this video about the kind of socially constructed nature of a lot of our mental health disorders. In any given year, as I noted, anywhere from 20 to 31% of people experience a mental disorder. You might be like, why is that such a large range? Well, think about what I just said on the last slide. A lot of people don't seek out treatment. So we can't always glean this data from medical records. We're asking people to diagnose themselves in questionnaires and surveys. And so there's some real reliability, validity issues there. But, I think kind of the general kind of takeaway consensus around this data is even if we don't have a set number that we can confidently point to, this is clearly a rather large issue in our society. And evidence does suggest that over 50% of people in America, adults in America, will experience mental disorder at some point in their lives. The most common disorders are related to major depressive disorder, as well as anxiety disorders, whether it's a specific phobia or just kind of a general social anxiety disorder. And then, of course, if we are also talking about substance abuse, alcohol abuse in particular contributes to a large percentage of these prevalence rates. So, the first few pages of your chapter really are focused on answering that first question you see there in orange: why do people develop mental disorders? And so we are going to talk about, what your book has to say about that. But then there is a related question that your book just kind of glosses over, which is, given that the symptoms of mental disorder are fairly common, and as we're about to discuss, we really can't, pinpoint an exact cause to most mental disorders. How does that impact how we diagnose them? So I'm going to be giving you some additional material that goes beyond the scope of the textbook about how do we diagnose. So that is, those two questions structure at least the first half of our lecture and its corresponding video. So the question: do we know what causes mental illness? So as your book notes, there's often no objective, clear-cut sign that someone is experiencing a mental illness. Instead, there is a reliance on what people tell the healthcare practitioners. So whether it's a doctor or a psychologist, psychiatrist, it's not the same thing as, taking someone's blood and, testing, whether or not they have high blood sugar, or wrapping a blood pressure cuff around someone's arm and checking their blood pressure. Mental illness, for the most part, does not show up in the body in such a way that we have diagnostic tests that allow us to kind of easily assess what's going on. Instead, how we diagnose, which we'll talk more about in a little bit, is based on what people say, what they say their symptoms are, what they say they're feeling. Now, obviously, this is problematic for just, a variety of reasons. We have issues with, unreliable narrators. We have issues of, people being honest, people knowing what to share. And then, of course, the practitioner knowing what to listen out for and accurately diagnosing it. So the issues could easily be, they're people that we miss out on diagnosing because they don't come forward, they don't share their information. And then there might be people that we misdiagnose, because they don't accurately report their symptoms, or the practitioner, doesn't accurately assess them. So, all of that is just a little bit problematic. But when you think about, what is it that is causing that mental illness, your textbook notes that there are kind of two different camps that explanations can fall into. The biological explanation is the one that's favored by mainstream medicine, and the focus is on genetics or imbalances in brain chemistry. And although there is some partial evidence that there are genetic or chemical contributors to certain mental illnesses, and I think in particular, your textbook discussed how depression in particular has been linked to kind of lower levels of serotonin. You know, there isn't very conclusive evidence of the biological underpinnings of a lot of medical health disorders and illnesses. Nevertheless, the biological explanation is the explanations that are favored, particularly by pharmaceutical industries, because, the assumption seems to be if the illness can be treated by a chemical, then it must have a biological or organic cause. And if you're in the business of selling chemicals to treat these mental health disorders, then that's certainly an explanation that works well in your favor, because the suggestion would be that if this is a biological or organic cause, then you're going to need something that treats that particular cause, whether that is a pharmaceutical, answer, or whether or not that is a surgery, It provides the medical model, the biological model, just kind of corresponds with the medical model's emphasis on diagnostics and treatment. The social camp, or the social explanation, it can fall into two general categories. There's the social causation explanation and the social constructionist explanation. So the social causation explanation implicates social inequality as being the cause of stress that becomes very toxic to the individual, and it tips them into mental illness. The social causation is basically saying it's not something that is genetic, so much as it is something that happens to you because of your positioning in society, and how you respond eventually to like this chronic toxic stress in your life. And the social constructionist explanation instead kind of argues, that mental illness does not in fact exist as fact or real. That instead society labels, for a variety of reasons, certain behaviors, certain responses, certain ways of thinking as being mentally ill, because it just falls outside of the range of what is socially acceptable, what is seen as being socially normative. And so, this question, you have a guy there that's talking about, UFOs, aliens. And perhaps, depending on what you believe, you may find him more or less crazy. But, just think about that term of calling people crazy for acting in a way that people just find disturbing. And they find it disturbing because it's going against whatever's considered normative for that society. So the label of this behavior as being indicative of a mental illness or a mental disorder is really a way to discredit and control, those who are different. Or certainly that is the social constructionist take on it, right? That we create this stigmatizing label for behavior or attitudes or beliefs, or, like I said, ways of thinking that don't align with what's normative in society. And then we medicalize it. We say, oh, okay, well, it's a mental illness. But people who fall into the social constructionist camp say, it's not so much a mental illness so much as it is this person just doesn't fit in with what is expected of them in that social context. So, where does your textbook authors land on this? Well, consider the quote from page 132. Both biological and social explanations can definitely tell us something about mental illness. We have, however, to be careful here of not falling into the trap that either explanation on its own is sufficient to address the complexity of mental health and illness. Because the fact is there are some mental illnesses where we've done a much better job, with our medical research of showing that there are some biological underpinnings to what is happening in that person's body. And then there are certain other mental illnesses that we can look at that certainly seem to be related to, people being stressed and being pushed to a breaking point, which would suggest the social causation explanation. And then, as we'll talk about in some upcoming slides, there are definitely examples of behaviors and traits that we label as being a mental illness now, or we used to label as being a mental illness. And the fact that there's been this flux in those labels, in that labeling process, has less to do with changes in technology and our ability to kind of prove that they exist. And it has more to do with changes in societal attitudes and definitions, which of course is supportive of the social constructionist explanation. So your book highlights what they call the critical realist approach. Particularly they speak of Pilgrim and Rogers, who in 2014 offered an explanation that combine both biological and social explanations by highlighting that humans are in fact both organic, biological, and social beings, and that culture and medicine both matter. But that furthermore, especially when you are kind of lifting up the role of medicine or the role of medical information, culture does shape medicine and medical information. That, some things that we take of as we take at face value of being medical knowledge as if it's objective, really that type of information is shaped in our social context. And like I said, sometimes it's hard to look at the information that we currently believe with that type of critical eye, but then we can certainly look at medical information that we have since discarded, and be like, oh gosh, yeah, that used to be accepted as fact, and now that's not. So for instance, because I teach gender, at one point it was thought that it wasn't recommended for women to, be educated because it made their brains heavier, which doctors felt like would lead them to have fertility issues because it would make their, uterus unviable for a fetus, right? So they thought that there was this connection between brain knowledge, brain size, and fertility. Of course, that is a piece of medical information that we've now discarded. During slavery, there was the belief that African Americans had a higher pain tolerance than whites, which was why there was less concern over social practices like hard labor and whipping and other types of abuses. And then that trickled over into medical information, where it was expected that African Americans did not need the same amount of anesthesia or pain medicine because they were tougher and had a higher pain tolerance. And of course, now, once again, we know that that is bunk. So, just kind of keeping in mind that medicine and medical information is shaped by culture as well. So, even those who prescribe to biological explanations must admit to some element of social constructionism in how we define, construct, and perceive mental illness. Your book gives you a great example of this, and it aligns with what was discussed in a previous chapter on sexuality, and that's how we define and think about homosexuality. It went from a sexual act that people did to a devalued identity because, of course, we coined those terms heterosexuality and homosexuality, in the Victorian era in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And heterosexual and homosexuality from the beginning was kind of seen as being a deviant identity comparative to heterosexuality. And then at some point, that devalued identity made its way into the DSM, which we'll be talking about here in a second. And it was codified as being a mental illness. But then it was removed from the DSM. That was one of the first, that was a major win for the, early gay rights movement. And once it was removed from the DSM as a mental illness, along with kind of growing public acceptance and tolerance, now it can be seen as just one of many forms of human sexuality. That is kind of the common perception of it now. So just look at all the twists and turns, this supposed objective definition, took in the span of 125 years. Other textbook examples of kind of the social constructed nature around mental illness, they talk about schizophrenia, how for a very long time it was misunderstood and seen and described as a Jekyll and Hyde personality versus, what it really is. They talk about the vague use of the term mental unbalance, and how it is employed, especially in some forms of media, to just make a kind of non-specific reference to the idea that someone has an unspecified mental illness. And then, of course, the fact that in earlier societies, mental illness was just believed to be a result from demon possession. And certainly I would say that most people have moved away from that explanation. But, in contemporary society, you can still see those elements of social construction around mental illness and mental health. The stigmatizing depictions in media of what a mentally ill person is like. the conflation with violence, right? Anytime there is a violent crime, particularly, like mass shootings or serial murders, right? There is this rush to conflate mental illness with violence, right? Oh, this person did this violent thing, they must be mentally ill. Which of course ignores the fact that there are all these people that who have a mental illness and are never violent. But that assumption that if you do this violent thing, you inherently must have a mental illness, right? That just kind of reflects our current kind of social stance, popular perspective on it. And then, of course, just the negative derogatory terminology, the type of terminology that you don't necessarily see associated with a lot of other illnesses of the body, is still very commonplace, to, hear people refer to the mentally ill as being psycho or loony or schizo, just saying that there is still this acceptability in a lot of circles, for these derogatory terms. So what does this mean in terms of diagnosis, right? The fact that although people can come from this biological or social explanation camp, but in terms of how do we actually diagnose people who have mental illnesses, well, that is much more in line with some of the observations made by the social camp. And that's because mental illness is largely diagnosed by relying on what the person is telling you about your symptoms, and then you use that instrument where you collect that data to make a diagnosis. And the instrument that you use to make that diagnosis is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It was first published in 1952. There have always been controversies around the DSM, in terms of what conditions are they recognizing, what types of measurements are they suggesting practitioners use in order to make their assessment. Every single DSM comes with a certain amount of controversy, and that includes the most recent version of the DSM, which is the DSM-5, which was released in 2013. And I give you a link to an article that just explains in what ways the DSM-5 deviated from the previous edition. One thing that we can certainly see as we look at, the distinctions between earlier versus later distinctions is the number of disorders that are recognized as being mental illnesses have increased. You look at the number of disorders that were in 1952, 1968, you can see steadily increasing. And then by the time we hit DSM-4 and then the revised version of 4, it held pretty steady. And 5, is largely in keeping with the number of disorders that we see in 4. And so once again, I feel like this is just evidence of that socially constructed nature. Like, did we become, more mentally ill? Did we develop new mental illnesses? No, not really. Did we develop better diagnostic tests so that we can clearly, see the impact of mental illness in a person's body and gather biological data that suggests they're mentally ill? Nope. For the most part, most of our diagnostic tests don't work that way. So perhaps what has changed, and largely what has changed is our recognition of some behaviors, some cognitive styles, some emotional states, as being problematic enough to rise to the definition of being labeled a mental illness. And so, if you're thinking about in terms of broad categories, these are the broad categories that are in the current version of the DSM-5. You'll see some that are related to substances, ones that are related to cognitive, ones that are, can be diagnosed in early childhood, mood disorders, which is where we put depression, which is, of course, one of the most common and prevalent disorders in the adult population. You can see anxiety disorders. Like I said, some are specialized, focused phobias, and some are just just general anxiety disorder. You see eating and sleeping disorders. You see that sexual and gender identity disorders. This was discussed in previous chapters. Gender dysphoria, gender identity disorder, is still, in the DSM. Um, However, as you can see, homosexuality is not. Um, And then there are impulse control disorders and personality disorders, as well. So all these broad categories. Now, what do those assessment tools look like? So this gives you an idea, and this was just the image that I chose, and it shows the difference between how they asked it in the DSM-4 and how they asked it in the DSM-5. But like I said, the key thing here is this is a tool where you're collecting data from the person that you're trying to diagnose. So you are reliant on their self-reported data. And like I said, that does raise kind of concerns around accuracy of reporting, reliable narrator issues. And then of course, the person that's collecting the data has to make an accurate assessment. So, all of that is to say that any number of things could potentially go wrong when you're doing these diagnoses. And so this is a critique that people have about mental illness, that tension that exists between the biomedical model and the social model. Having a very strict and stringent biomedical approach to mental illness is hard, in the sense that, for the most part, these are illnesses that we can't really, see in the body. We cannot collect information from the body showing that that mental illness is there for a lot of them. And there are certainly people that have critiques and concerns about this. One person, Thomas Saz, he wrote that an illness is real only if it affects the body in a way we can see. If it's not affecting the body in a way we can see, he argues that instead what we're doing is we're just responding to difference with medical labels. And for him, he was concerned that this medicalization can be very problematic, because oftentimes these labels are stigmatizing, and by applying that stigmatizing label to a person, we're doing them more harm than help. Another kind of critique of this way of diagnosing people, comes out of the Rosenhan study, which I give you a video if you want to watch and learn more about that. But the name of the study, which has now, it's come under criticism multiple times. It certainly was not a well done study, and there are some concerns about the reliability and validity of the data, but it's called On Being Sane and Insane in Places. And Rosenhan and some of his graduate assistants and volunteers, basically what they did was they checked themselves into mental health asylums. They by basically providing the responses that they knew would lead to them receiving a diagnosis of having a mental illness. However, once they were in the asylums, they then proceeded to stop displaying, those signs of mental illness, and claiming that they have those symptoms of mental illness, to see to what extent would practitioners who worked in the asylums, to what extent they would notice and realize, okay, this person really is not mentally ill, they need to be released. And at the time, the big takeaway was, in a lot of cases, it took a very long time, for people to notice this person isn't mentally ill. And once again, it just kind of poked some holes and raised some concerns about relying on diagnostics that pretty much are just people's self-reports and people's assessments of those self-reports. Now, has it always been this way? I'm going to spend the next couple of slides giving you a kind of just quick history lesson about the progression of mental illness in society. And what I mean by that is a progression in how mental illness was explained, approached, perceived, and treated. So, we're not going to go all the way back to early history. We're going to begin with around the Middle Ages, and then the Renaissance and post-Renaissance. So it's worth noting that, during this time period, supernatural explanations were really common And you know, whether that meant demon possession or work of the devil once, you know, Christianity became more popular. But these were the explanations that a lot of people turned to because the role of religion was so big in society at this point. And of course, we haven't reached the Enlightenment era, so the role of science is pretty much minimal. So, you know, magic and religion are play huge roles in society. And so a person who's mentally ill, the explanation provided was often supernatural. And although most people no longer hold on to this view, not everyone has given it up. Certainly there are still societies that believe in demon possession, that there are still, you know, priests and other people who perform exorcisms, and then of course certainly people believe in divine healing, which has similar roots. As we move out of the kind of Middle Ages into the Renaissance, you know, we start to move away from the supernatural explanations, but people at this point, the mentally ill, are largely seen as being incurable, and inferior, individuals, not fully human. And so during this time period, you know, the mentally ill, depending on the mental illness and the extent of the mental illness, there are a lot of possibilities in terms of how they could be treated and perceived, none of them very good. They were persecuted as witches. They were labeled as being fools or the village idiot. There was your book mentions, how during this time period, sometimes they would round up all people who had this label of being fools, and they would put them on a ship and literally just send the ship out to sea. So, basically, just expelling them from society and killing them in the process as they just drift out to sea. This is also when we start to begin to see institutionalization. During the latter part of this period, the first mental hospital was founded by a Catholic priest in Spain in 1409. But the kind of like common, reoccurring theme for under all of this is just this inhumane treatment. And although some people are going to start pushing back against this by advancing the ideas that the mentally ill were still human, and they were just suffering from a medical illness, and they weren't simply sinners, criminals, possessed people. At this time period, those people pushing back against the inhumane treatment, they are in the minority. Now, as we enter into the 18th and 19th century, after we've had, the Enlightenment era and, the rise of science, science and medicine kind of replacing religion and supernatural in these types of matters, we have the rise of what's called moral treatment. In the United States, we have the first hospital designed to provide moral treatment in 1817. So the thing about moral treatment is, it was meant to provide a humane setting for the mentally ill in hopes that they could recuperate. It was based on the idea that these people were not, that these people were salvageable. They could be saved. They could be treated. It's right there in the word, moral treatment. Now, where that treatment was taking place was in institutions. And so, the rise of moral treatment aligns with a time period called the Great Confinement. And so I'm going to go to the next slide about the Great Confinement, then I'm going to come back. So, during the time period of Great Confinement, you have people locking people away, largely because they were deemed insane. But these people were not always insane. Sometimes they were just poor. Sometimes they were women who their husbands wanted out of their marriage, or their children wanted to seize their assets. But you would lock these people away in an asylum, in a prison. And humane treatment was like, this doesn't have to be just containment. You can provide humane care, and you have kind of an American advocate Doretha Dix, who in 1840, after visiting a lot of asylums and seeing how people were treated, she really advocated, that these asylums could provide better care. And that really was the idea behind, go back to my other slide, behind, moral treatment. That yes, people would be locked away, but that you would provide them with, uh, a safe space, and you would provide them with the resources they need to get well and get better and be reintegrated back into society. Unfortunately, this isn't what a lot of asylums became, just because of the amount of cost that were associated with those types of asylums, and the fact that for a lot of people who were getting locked up, especially if they were poor or racial minorities, they weren't deemed as being deserving of that type of treatment. So moral treatment began to decline, even as confinement remained very popular. And that just, why did they decline? Like I said, part of it had to do with there wasn't kind of a cohesive program. The asylums were overcrowded. And like I said, they started to be used as a way to send people who weren't in fact mentally ill. There was still the theory that among some people that madness was incurable. Some critics, felt like it was, the focus was on patient conformity, taking people who are just different and making them become conformists. So, some critics didn't support it for that reason. And then the final reason, the influence of psychiatrists with emphasis on medical treatment. Certainly a nail in the moral treatment coffin was the rise of the medical model, because that model, which of course focused on the potential biological causes of mental illness, the answer in the medical model wasn't going to be, let's give people a safe space to recuperate, and let's give them resources and social interaction in hopes that this will fix them. Of course, the medical model is going to be focusing on medical treatment, surgeries, pharmaceuticals, and the rise of psychotherapy, which we'll talk about in a second. And so as we enter in the 19th century and go into the 20th century, we have the rise of the medical model and the beginning reliance on therapies. And so Sigmund Freud at this time is developing psychotherapy. And that's an approach to mental health in which patients talk with trained professionals to gain insight into the cause of their problems. And oftentimes, I provide you a video for psychotherapy and Sigmund Freud, but oftentimes these problems were seen as being rooted in things that happened in their childhood, that has now led to them having impulse control issues, or issues of repression. And then at the same time, as you have the rise of psychotherapy, you also have the rise of other medical approaches, because of the kind of salience of the medical explanation at this time for mental illness. You have lobotomies where people are like, okay, we're going to go in and we're going to, cut out parts of people's brains. Electroshock therapy became very popular during this time period. And this is also where we start to see some of our earlier versions of psychoactive drugs. So drugs meant to change the brain chemistry. By the time we enter into the 21st century, the medical model is still going strong, but you're starting to see some pushback, certainly in some circles, sociological academic circles, where the focus is now on that social approach, that social model of illness. And one of those academics your book talks about is Erving Goffman, and he is a symbolic interactionist. For those of you who still remember the discussion of the theoretical frameworks from the beginning of the semester. And he was really interested in how mental illness is the label of being mentally ill kind of becomes a source of stigma. And stigma is a mark of social disgrace, it's social devaluation. In some way, we're violating other people's expectations in an undesirable way, and thus we are recognized as being deviant. Your textbook identifies like kind of three broad groups that can contribute to, you having the stigma. There are physical stigmas, and, they give examples of that, like facial scarring or physical impairment. There are personal character stigmas, and that's where mental health, mental illness falls. They also mention sexuality as being an example of that type of stigma. And then there's social stigma, and that's when you just have a group membership in a group that isn't valued by society. So this would be like most racial ethnic minorities, for example. But they note that really, almost anything could potentially become a stigma, because stigmas are highly relational and context specific, which means they're fluid and they're kind of dependent on where you are and who you're around, and what's going on at the time. Now, your book talks about passing, but I want to introduce another term from Goffman before we get to that, and that's master status. So, we all have a lot of social statuses. We have our race, we have our gender, we have our sexual orientation, we have our, religious affiliation, we have our socioeconomic status, we have our age group. So we all have a lot of statuses, and so people who know us, who understand us, they think about us as being a constellation of those statuses. However, if we have a status that is usually, but not always, so stigmatizing that it kind of cancels out all of our other statuses, we refer to that status as being a master status. Now, it's worth noting that master statuses they aren't inherently negative. You could also maybe have a status that's just like so admirable and so rare and so impressive that once again, it cancels out all your other statuses. So, like let's say you're an Olympic gold medalist, or, you're a Nobel Peace Prize winner, or, hell, you're the president. Those are positive master statuses. But let's be honest, a lot of those statuses are not in the reach for a lot of us. So for the, everyday citizen, if they have a master status, it's oftentimes one that is negative, one like where the status has such a strong stigma that if someone finds this out about you, it kind of subsumes all your other statuses. So certainly in the 80s, 90s, early aughts, maybe less so today, being HIV positive or having AIDS was considered a master status. If someone found out that about you, it meant, your race, or, your socioeconomic status, or your, status as a full-time student or a mother, none of those statuses really mattered anymore because you had that master status. For a lot of, in a lot of circles, being a ex-felon, that's the type of status, or having served time, being an ex-convict period, can become a master status. The argument is to what extent does mental illness, certain types of mental illness in particular, do they exist as master statuses for people? Think about, something like schizophrenia, where, oftentimes the social perception around it is very fearful and very negative. If someone knows that about you, that you have diagnosed, schizophrenia, you run the risk of that canceling out all your other statuses, and that's just how people will see you. And then, of course, the concern is will they treat you differently? And I give you a little graph from a research article that kind of suggests just that, people report that they are unwilling to have a person with a mental illness, marry into their family. Over 68% felt that way, or work closely with them, or spend an evening socializing with them. that they put these limits on people that have this status. They treat them with a certain amount of bias. And so that's why, your book does talk about the concept of passing, right? Where people will try to hide, this aspect of themselves that comes with an associated stigma. They develop a routine, and they call upon resources to pass, so that this stigma is not readily observable, and therefore they can perhaps avoid being labeled by it, stigmatized by it, and having it be their master status. And we'll come back to that discussion of labeling later in the presentation. But for right now, to keep going with my mental illness through the ages, we reached also in the 21st century, from a policy standpoint, we have what's called deinstitutionalization. And so this is like, we're still institutionalizing in asylums, public hospitals, prisons. We're still institutionalizing a lot of the mentally ill. Under President Ronald Reagan, in order to kind of cut some federal budgets, and he basically withdrew public funding for a lot of public mental asylums, and hospitals. And we call this deinstitutionalization. These people were released from hospitals into their local communities. And although he escalated it, we had already started to see that shift as early as the 1960s, where, Congress was passing the Community Mental Health Centers Construction Act, to try to provide more resources for outpatient centers. And, deinstitutionalization perhaps would have been more successful if there would have been more outpatient centers built, during those decades leading up to that mass release. But the fact of the matter is there is not enough places that provide sufficient outpatient care to the mentally ill, and thus only 42% of people with mental illness receive regular treatment. And even if you limit it to people that actually have severe mental illnesses and disorders, it's still only 63%, so a little under 2/3. And so instead they are just kind of out in the community. And so when you think about, if you've ever witnessed like a homeless person who seems to be having a mental breakdown, or, or if you know someone closely in your neighborhood or your family, part of that issue is that after deinstitutionalization, a lot of the care for those people was shifted upon their families, their communities, and those kind of overburdened outpatient centers. And there was not necessarily a lot of protection that was provided for them in terms of, employment, and receiving, insurance, certain forms of public insurance, until 1997, where the American with Disabilities Act finally included mental health and provided people, some protections in terms of, how they're treated in, their schools, by potential employers, in public spaces and places. And the final kind of, important change or shift we see in the 21st century, and this comes later towards the 21st century, is we start to see the remedicalization, the resurgence of the medical model. One way we see that is, especially once we find a way to unpack the human genome and study genetics in much better detail, you start to see the geneticization of deviant behavior, right? People search for, genetic links to things like, everything from alcoholism to infidelity to, what we, call the sociopath gene, right? We're looking for, genetic determinants for people's behavior. Now that we have the ability to kind of compare different genomes, in families. We also see, of course, an explosion in the pharmaceutical industry. Now there are so many psychiatric medications available, particularly in the US. And this is a multi-billion dollar industry. And unlike other countries where the pharmaceutical industry is not allowed to directly market itself to people, here in America, of course, you can't flip through a magazine or watch an hour on TV without seeing an ad for pharmaceuticals, basically marketing itself directly to the patient, convincing the potential patient, you're depressed, go to your doctor and ask for this medicine. You're feeling anxious, go to the doctor and ask for this medicine. You can't sleep, go to the doctor and ask for this medicine. And so that is kind of the other kind of major trend that we saw by the close of the 21st century. So before we jump back specifically into the textbook material about patterns of mental health, if this class was in person, these are just some questions that I like to always kind of encourage students to think about in regards to the current social context of mental illness. Think about what influences a person's decision to seek help. Because diagnosis is based on people's self-reported behaviors, feelings, moods, that means that people have to be willing to go in to seek help. And think about the reasons why this doesn't happen. Obviously, one issue has to do with accessibility. Are there places for people to go? Affordability, can they afford to go in? But then also, those concerns about, being labeled and it becoming your master status. And if people in your kind of social world how they might treat you, how it might result in stigmatization. So, some of this definitely reflects, our data, because our data is based on people that have gone in most cases willingly, and been diagnosed. And so think about what this means in terms of the data we have around mental health illnesses and disorders in regards to sex, race, class, and age, because there are definitely going to be some built-in issues around, who is under and overrepresented in those statistics. And like I said, some of this is rooted in individuals' perceptions of social support versus stigmatization. But then some of this is also rooted in larger kind of social structural policy barriers, things related to insurance, and like I said, healthcare costs, health practitioner accessibility. Those aspects also will impact help-seeking behavior among the mentally ill. And then, of course, there's that role of labeling. I said we were going to come back to that. It is a debate, to what extent does the public fear and avoid the mentally ill, or are we more tolerant than we used to be? Is being a mentally, ill individual, a mental patient, is that still a master status and a status that can result in stigmatization? We do know that oftentimes people will resist labeling themselves as mentally ill. They're more likely to describe their symptoms as being, a passing disorder or a mood, or, a bad habit if you're talking about like substance abuse or those types of disorders. And we also know that people's families resist labeling their family members as mentally ill. And a lot of this is of course related to concerns about labeling and stigmatization. Some families will go so far as to practice what is called accommodation, right? Which, they find ways as families to accommodate a person's kind of differences in regards to behavior or cognition or mood, so that it becomes normal, or at least normative in that family, for that person to behave, think, feel that way, as opposed to going in the other direction of, determining that this family member has a problem and encouraging them to seek help for mental illness. And of course, this just contributes to the burden of being a caregiver. Whether your family member has a diagnosed mental illness or they have an undiagnosed mental illness that you're seeking to accommodate, oftentimes there is a lot of burden on family members to be caregivers if those family members with a mental illness are unable to be self-sufficient, cannot be trusted to take a care of themselves, if they cannot hold down a job or a form of employment, and cover their basic needs. That burden does shift onto families. And like I said, especially, in a society post deinstitutionalization, it shifts on the families who absorb the burden as much or as little as, they can, depending on the family. And then if the family is unable to or refuses to absorb that burden, who does it shift to? Well, with deinstitutionalization, it doesn't really shift to the government anymore, which is why you see such a large proportion of the homeless, particularly the male homeless, they have an active mental illness. And this is also an issue that comes up with policing, that for, especially in some of the larger cities, a lot of the calls that police go out on is related less to criminality and more to mental illness. And the people that they arrest and they put in jail, even temporarily, if those are people that are experiencing a mental illness break or, a issue with mental illness, is prison really the best place for them? Not really, but in most areas, if there isn't a publicly available hospital, especially a long-term care hospital, where else do these people go if they don't have families that can take care of them anymore? And so, these are, long-term consequences, you have to consider in regards to the mentally ill. And even for people who don't have a severe mental illness, one thing that they often speak of is that they are trying to balance, figure out, is it worth the treatment? Is the benefits of treatment worth the potential harm of the stigma? As a society, we haven't accomplished this balance yet. We haven't found a way to make the benefits of treatment accessible and affordable for everyone. But then in addition to that, we really haven't found a way to make it non-stigmatizing for most people as well. And it is that stigma that is going to keep some people from seeking out help, even when it's available and even when they can afford it. So your book, the latter half, focuses on patterns of mental illness. I'm not going to say a whole lot about most of this. I'm just going to kind of quickly note, that for some disorders and illnesses, there is a pattern of uneven distribution in regards to social class, race, ethnicity, and gender. So, that's just a fancy way of saying that for some mental illnesses and disorders, we can denote consistent patterns that, race seems to matter, gender seems to matter, social class seems to matter in terms of who is diagnosed with it. So for, mental health for across racial and ethnic categories, particularly for American Indians, Native Americans, Alaska Natives, they have some of the highest prevalence rates when it comes to mental illness, while Asian Americans have some of the lowest. And non-Hispanic whites are next, and then African Americans and Hispanic Americans are roughly around the same amount. Of course, all of this, is complicated by the fact, like I said, this is based on people coming forward or people being institutionalized and diagnosed, so these aren't, and it's based on, the self-reports or the observable behaviors of individuals. So this isn't great data, in that sense. Certainly there are, some disorders and diseases where there seems to be more of a racial pattern than others, particularly those disorders and diseases related to anxiety and stress. And your book talks about that, how, the experience of racism seems to impact mental health much more so than even physical health in most industrialized nations. I am going to spend a little bit more time on gender because our data there is a little bit more conclusive than what we have for race. Women display higher rates of certain mental illnesses than men, particularly depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, and eating slash body image disorders. Your book does put out, at one point it was considered, maybe this was like a measurement era, what they call a measurement artifact. And therefore it wasn't a real gender gap. But subsequent research, particularly research related to depression, has indicated that this is not the case. And so they talk about the Brown and Harris model, which links the onset of depression in women to other factors being present. They talk about, what are some other current vulnerability factors? What are some provoking agents? What factors are kind of like already existing, in the background, like background social factors like social class. And they say all of these things kind of combine in the model, and they give you a depiction of the model on page 140, to suggest that for anxiety disorders and depression, women are more likely to experience this than men. And you see some kind of statistics there that suggests, that a greater number of women versus men indicate that they're anxious as well as depressed. Your book then focuses just more on depression in general. And they do say that, one issue about measuring depression, which is an increasingly common condition, is that, there has to be this distinction between how it's used in common parlance versus its technical medical definition when discussing clinical depression. And I give you a depression checklist, that kind of indicates some of the symptoms that practitioners are looking for to make that diagnosis for clinical depression. But keep in mind, this checklist does occur in a cultural context, and your book does note that, culturally it can vary whether a society sees depression as being largely an emotional response, and therefore, not necessarily an illness, more likely to be temporary and non-pervasive, or, whether or not they are more likely to define it and perceive it as being a medical condition and a disease. And so they talk about, the difference between countries that see it one way versus the other. In the United States, that gender gap in depression that we see later in life appears to start early. Teenage girls are more likely than boys to face depression, according to statistics, and they're more likely to receive treatment. But this becomes complicated when we then look at suicide rates, because we oftentimes think about depression being a major contributing factor to suicide. So if you looked at suicide rates, if you looked at depression rates, you'd be like, oh, well, women are going to have a higher level of a higher rate of suicide than men. But this is in fact not the case. So, focusing back on our teenagers, female high school students are more likely to report that they've seriously considered suicide. But then if you actually look at who commits suicide among teens, you can see that there is a sizable distinction between men and women, and that, both have increased in the last at the time this data was analyzed, between 2009 and 2016. There has been a significant increase among women, among young girls and young boys, but that gap between boys and girls remains significant. And that gap continues into adulthood. If you're looking at the rates, and this is from 1950 to 2017, you can pretty much consistently see that men are much more likely than women to die by suicide. And it's worth noting that in most countries, that is the case. If you look at the male to female ratio of suicide rates, they say that any ratio greater than 1 indicates that suicide rates are higher than men. So you can look, and those are all the countries that are in some shade of blue. So just look at the very small number of countries that are yellow or orange, like it's really only like 2. And then look at the countries where you see that shade of blue, and the darker the shade of blue, the greater the ratio, the greater number of men compared to women who are committing suicide. And so, this just kind of complicates, and this is, it complicates our understanding of, that relationship between depression, and suicide when we then consider the gendered aspect. But, your book kind of closes and focuses on, just suicide, generally speaking, because suicide has been a topic that has, captured the sociological imagination very early in the discipline. Emil Durkheim, one of our sociology forefathers, one of his works was entitled Suicide. He published it in 1897. And in this book, he was looking at the larger social factors that can inhibit suicide, as opposed to kind of encourage, or we won't say promote, but we'll say just make it more likely. And he created a typology, where he defines suicide as being either egoistic, anomic, altruistic, or fatalistic. Um, Egoistic suicide is suicide that occurs when a person is not sufficiently integrated into society. And for him, he especially focused on this form of suicide because he felt like it explained why suicide rates were higher in Protestant nations versus Catholic nations, because Protestant nations emphasized individualism, while Catholicism was more likely to emphasize community. And so by focusing more on community, people were more integrated in those types of societies and less likely to engage in egoistic suicide. The second type, this is what happens when society fails to regulate the individual. Usually because of some type of societal collapse, in terms of the norms. And we call that, when that happens in society, we say that society is experiencing anomie. And so this type of suicide, anomic suicide, is, when you almost aren't sure what society expects of you in terms of norms and behaviors. And this leads to, people just being, bewildered and unsure and hopeless. And he gives the example of the spike in suicides after the 1928 stock market crash, that preceded, of course, the onset of the Great Depression in America. Altruistic suicide is linked to a sense of duty. This happens when people are maybe too highly integrated into society, because in this sense, they value the community and societal expectations over their own individual well-being. And so, he talks about, Japanese kamikaze pilots. And your book also talks about, Irish Republican hunger strikers, the Hindu practice of sati, where, a wife kills herself at her husband's funeral because, of the traditional logic that, her life no longer has any meaning because her husband is dead. And then finally, there's fatalistic suicide. And this form of suicide just, refers to the despair of living in a highly regulated society where you don't have enough personal freedom or control. So you literally engage in fatalistic suicide, in order to escape that society. And the example that he gave, was, historically in societies that relied on slave labor, the high rate of suicide that would be exhibited in slaves. And it's just worth noting, as your book notes, his typology has been studied, it's been critiqued. Some of those critiques have led to people just largely rejecting it. Some of the critiques have led to it being revised. Your textbook notes one revision, Taylor's typology, where they shift the focus less on social factors and more on individual factors. Which is more psychological and less sociological. But for Taylor, he described ectopic suicides, which were kind of based on people's view of themselves, versus symphysic suicide, which is kind of based on their perception of their relationship to others. And for ectopic, there were two types. There was submissive, and this is where people basically decide there's no point in going on, and they just decide that their life is at an end. And it could be because of, something, really traumatic happening to them. It could be because, they received, a health diagnosis, of a terminal illness. But basically, they carry out their suicide attempt with the full intention of taking their life. But this is compared to, and I know I'm probably gonna just destroy the pronunciation, thanatation suicide. And this type of suicide, there are feelings of uncertainty, and people, your textbook notes, they aren't as earnest, they aren't as certain about this suicide attempt as people who engage in submissive suicide. And so they're almost leaving it up to chance, right? So like, oh, if I survive this attempt, it must be meant to be. It's that type of attitude. And then symphysic suicide, which is related to people's relationships with others, there are two types. They're sacrifice suicides, and this is where people take their own life to make others kind of feel guilty, in this form of suicide, they're more likely to leave a note blaming others. And then there's appeal suicide, and this occurs when someone's uncertain how others feel about them, and they are not necessarily trying to end their life, but it's more almost a test of the reactions of other people. And so they might stage their suicide attempt, whether successful or not, in front of another person or other people to see how they'll respond, and to see and to use that as a gauge as to whether or not that person cares about them or not. The chart you see just gives you an idea of suicide rates around the world. You can see that United States is pretty highly ranked, in comparison to some of our other Western counterparts. And so, that's something for you to just kind of think of, whether you like the Durkheim, certainly from the Durkheim perspective, looking at the number of people that commit suicide in the United States, would you consider it to be based on fatalistic reasons or egoistic reasons, anomic reasons? But we end with this quote from 145. A theme running through this chapter has been how distress, suffering, and mental health issues are framed and very much influenced by society. And so just know that that is kind of the sociological stance, even something that is going on inside your head, something based on your moods or your personality or your brain chemistry. Most sociologists still take that social approach, that this is happening in a larger social context. And that is why it's important to kind of consider those sociological, those social forces that are in play.